morning, everybody. It's bright and early. Actually, it's not very bright, but it's early anyway. Thank you for coming. I know it's 8:45, so it shows a lot of commitment. Thank you for coming. My name's Alex Lee. I'll be the moderator here. Today, we have a somewhat provocative title, Promised Land or Fennessy. This is a problem among many different domain in the life we experience every day, and that, if you imagine the product that you use every day, take a look at any piece of them, right? Most of them are exported and imported from one country to the next very easily, and you ship the same product everywhere. And even though every country's got different product safety regulations, every country's got all different sort of quality control regulations, but yet the product ships everywhere smoothly. The instrument of that is ISO standard. That's what enables us to have free trade around the world. So this is a new topic for privacy. So how can we take the lessons that we have from all the products that you have in front of you, wearing it, right? And extract that lesson and see if we can apply that to privacy. And that's sort of the promised land. And let's see if it is a fantasy on the other hand. So on the stage with me, we have a very good panel. So I'll do a quick introduction to everybody. Starting from your right is Erik Boucher. He's from the CNIL, the French DPA, and he's an IT expert there, and he has actually done a lot of work to further this particular standard. He participated in the development of this very standard, ISO 27701, and he also is an expert in IoT, among other things, so that's a lot we can tap his brain on today. And next to him is Cristina Monti. Cristina is from DG Justice, and her specialty is on cross-border data flow and certifications and other mechanisms. And then next to Cristina is Erik Lachaud. Erik is from University of Tilburg, and he's a researcher there, and he has done a lot of work around certification and GDPR certification and ISO 27701. He has quite a few papers out, and in fact, I think, is it too early to tell people you have one coming? So look forward to more research to come. And then next to Erik is Fennessy. She's from IAPP. Before IAPP, she was in the Department of Commerce and actually responsible for Privacy Shield. And next to Caitlin is Willy. Willy is from British Standard Institute. He is a lead auditor for a whole lot of things, including information security and, business continuity, quality management, among many other, privacy, of course. How can I forget? Among other things. So, for example, if we were to have BSI do audit for Microsoft, we'll have to get past Willy somehow, somewhere. So he's a real expert in the area. And lastly is, my name's Alex Lee. I'm from Microsoft. I'm responsible for certification policies at Microsoft, mostly connecting various certification regimes, such as that of potentially Article 42 of GDPR, and something like ISO 27701, or even the Cybersecurity Act certifications. Those are the areas that I work on. So with that introduction of everybody on the panel, I will outline what we're going to walk through today. First, we're going to do a little bit of introduction of what the standard is about and why we created it in the first place, and walk through sort of the structure of it, because I suspect a number of you have never seen the standard. So just a little table setting. But the bulk of the discussion will be talking about how does the standard, like an ISO standard like this, connect with various regulatory requirements around the world. it was designed to deal with different regulatory requirements everywhere, including GDPR. But how does that really work? So I'm going to poke the panels here and to see if we can find out anything. I'll encourage a lot of interaction between the panelists and ask provocative questions if at all possible. And hopefully we'll come to a place where we figure out where we have agreement, where we have disagreement, where we need to work on, and that's the purpose of this panel, and hopefully therefore make your time worthwhile. So with that, can we get to the slide? I'm going to call on the first slide and sort of the impetus of why we want to do something like this. And this is actually Caitlin's slide. She sent it to me to explain. Well, Caitlin, I think you do a better job explaining why we have this. And certainly this resonates strongly with Microsoft.
Sure. Thank you so much, Alex. It's great to be here, and I'm really grateful to all of you for getting up so early to talk about, as we were saying, such an exciting topic as standards at 8:45 in the morning, so thanks for being here. As Alex said, I represent the IAPP, and we do in-depth research and sometimes survey-based research to help privacy professionals globally. And so what you're looking at here is the results of a survey that we conducted this past fall of 2019, basically looking at how privacy professionals around the world are operationalizing different privacy requirements. And the one question that we asked that I found most interesting was whether companies are adopting kind of segmented or regionally based regionally based privacy programs or aiming for a global privacy strategy. What we found, I thought was really interesting, was that over half, 56% of privacy professionals around the world among our respondents were at least aiming for a global privacy program or strategy, bringing together all of the legal requirements that they face around the world. We saw, as you can see here, that 24% segment by geography. There's a smaller percentage that are only facing a law in one region. I would suspect those are more smaller companies. But the majority are looking to have one global privacy program. When we explore a little more in depth anecdotally in the report on this, and in talking to privacy professionals, it seemed that yes, while the majority are shooting for a global privacy program, they typically have one, and then they have to kind of address regional nuances or country-specific nuances or even state-specific nuances in some instances where there are incompatibility, but they're trying to bring it all together. And I put the second chart that you see below that, just to give you a sense of the number of privacy laws that folks are trying to make sense of and map together. And you see maybe a quarter or so that are only looking at one, but you see a full 10% that are grappling with 50 or more. And I recently heard the stat, I'm still trying to verify it, but that globally there are over 600 privacy-related laws in effect today. Now that includes subnational, it includes state, and it includes ones that aren't, privacy-focused but kind of touch on privacy. So it's a lot to plug in together, and I think what you'll hear from Alex in the panel today is about how ISO can act as a converter and allow folks to plug all of these different requirements in. So yeah, just setting the stage.
I think that explains the justification of why companies are really looking at a global approach to things. So the next slide, actually this is my slide. So I kind of, as a moderator, hijack a little bit. But those of you who've seen my presentation, this is sort of my slide one. So Caitlin, talk about the need for global integration from companies. And the way that, which explains why we do what we do with ISO 27701, why we design in the first place. The purpose is to find a way to reconcile all these requirements, either from GDPR or LGPD, that's from Brazil, or CCPA, and you name it, you know, all 300 of those that we can identify. And the idea is to reconcile these sort of diverse requirements, regulatory requirements, which we all have to adhere to, into a set of ISO controls. And I'm sure during the panel discussions, especially those who are involved in the standard development, we can talk about what the controls are. Is to reconcile them so it all makes sense. Instead of giving our engineering team, compliance team, 300 sets of laws to try to interpret, we give them a succinct set of requirements to adhere to and to measure the performance by. And then now we have reconciled compliance controls that can be used for product development and service development and so on and so forth. Of course, the end output is goods and services that can be delivered to customers. But part of the output is also a set of evidence as to which how a company adheres to the compliance control that was set forth. So you can, maybe in a more layman's term, think of that as design specifications. When you finish making a product, you have to assess whether you met those specifications that you designed for, otherwise you fail. That's really that simple. And the end of that, you can have a third-party auditor or internal auditors to assess whether that has been done correctly. So, for example, Willy from BSI could come in and inspect whether we have the right policy in place and we have actually executed as we designed to do so. And of course, in the end of that process, there will be a set of certification. I won't talk about the accreditation, which we will get to, I'm sure, and how that all generate a set of evidence that can be basically standardized and uniformly shown to this particular company's customers. So in the case of, for example, Microsoft, if you pick on us, is that we have thousands and thousands of enterprise customers. Instead of trying to explain to every single bank and every single retailers or pharmaceutical company or hospitals as to how we adhere to various regulations, we have one uniform set of communication. So we're all talking apples and apples. Another aspect of it, it's really important, is that if you look at the product development set of gears in the middle, that process typically involves, these days, many different actors. It's no longer just one company. So for example, Microsoft acts primarily as a processor for Azure, Office 365, and what have you. But we have thousands of sub-processors. How do we make sure they are also adhering to the requirement around the world? Yes, we can then throw them all 300 plus regulations and ask them to promise that they'll meet it, but I have no way to have a succinct set of evidence that we can examine. With a certification from ISO 27701, then we have a unified set of evidence we can examine from all of them, no matter where they operate. And that's really the design intent of that. And I'll invite particularly Erik Boucher. Do you have any thoughts on this? I mean, I'm sure actually the standard was actually proposed by the French national body. So I don't know if Erik, you have anything to add to why it was born in the first place.
Oh. Well, morning to everyone. And in fact, it was a long process, and we have to go back to the basic, I would say, ISO standards, which are about information security, which is a 27,000 series. Maybe you are aware of that. And, it's about management system and controls, measures that will ensure that your information is securely handled. But we also started designing standards about privacy, about privacy principles, and then, well, we wanted to integrate both. Because information security is kind of part of privacy management, privacy controls, so it was quite logical to go to another standard, which is 27701, which would integrate privacy management system, which is in fact information security and privacy management system. So it will take both because, well, in the end, you still have to protect data, whether they are just data or personal data, privacy. So privacy is really part of the IT problems we face nowadays. So that's why CNIL and other DPS were very interested in building a new standards that would integrate information security and privacy.
No. Anything to add from the panel?
No, it's okay.
Yeah, and if none, let's move forward to the next set of slides. Actually, that's from...
That's mine.
So that tells you a little bit about what the standard is. I don't know, actually, maybe Erik, do you want to, since these are your slides,
you want me, to present
go
my
ahead,
slides?
Please. Yeah,
this
is
is
your
what
slides, so
you are requesting, okay.
I'll take it from the horse's mouth,
okay,
right?
Well, yeah. Well, yes, I would just, add something above, what you said just before. We need to keep in mind that this new standard, focusing on privacy, is building on another one, which is, the IT security one. This is an extension. This new standard is an extension of the ISO 27001. Maybe you are aware about that. And that's quite important to keep in mind because this is an approach, a special approach that ISO is suggesting. And then you need to keep in mind when we are going to discuss about the compatibility of this ISO approach with the GDPR. To come back to this presentation, what does it do? It set a set of criteria, what we are calling requirement and control, designed to comply with the interpretation of data protection coming from the ISO. They are calling that privacy. We are not going to discuss about the difference between data protection and privacy here. It will be certainly too long. However, they are stemming on another ISO standard. They have already published, which is public if you want to have a look, which is the 29,100. Which is saying, which is defining a bunch of rules, on privacy. And they have built, this new standard from this standard. This is a management system. What is a management system? This is, I would say, a set of rules to organize, I would say, the compliance here. They have called PIMS, which is Personal Information Management System, which is an extension of the Information Security Management System, ISMS, sorry for all of that stuff. What they are looking is to ensure data protection, what we call privacy, as potentially affected, by the processing of personal data. I reminded, the wording of the ISO about that, and they are not using personal data because most of the time they are using their own terminology, which is more or less, I would say, the same you are using, in GDPR, and they are using rather, instead of personal data, personal identifiable information. You need also to keep in mind you have some differences in the terminology. And lastly, as you said rightly, the compliance with this standard is certifiable by a third-party certification body. Just to correct you, if you want to be certified, you need to use a third party like the BSI. If you are doing, internally, of course, you can certify, but it will not be really certified in the sense of the ISO, I would say.
Yes, that's only for internal satisfaction, but not for...
Of course, yes, you can apply without certifying as well.
Yep. So shall we move to the next slide where
The
you
next
can...
as well.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, sure. Why-
Tell me.
Cover it.
Well,
And we'll have follow-up questions after
Yeah,
that.
all
I think
right.
that's the
It's a
table.
surprise. Yes, it was a surprise. Well, and then, thank you very much.
It's waking you up.
Yeah, no, you're nice, you're nice. If you want, yeah, it was, I would say it's a discussion we have, because you are not able to certify compliance of this new standard alone. You need to do, as an extension of certification of ISO 27001. And this is something, again, you should keep in mind, because there is a pre-requirement of security, to be able, to certify compliance with new standards. And this is an approach, again, and I think it's debatable. This is also essential that all asset management are included. Yes, there is also a requirement. You need, to put in place your ISMS and your IT system, IT security management system before to be able, to include all the assets, managing personal data into this ISMS. And again, this is a pre-requirement, and this is, of course, a security requirement to apply, unfortunately, privacy. Of course, you need to comply with all requirements. This is not an open bar saying, okay, well, I'm using what I want. If you want to do it, this is a guideline and you can do it. But if you want to certify compliance, you need to apply all, the requirements. Of course, you need to request, and we have already said, the third-party certification body. The ISO is not requiring, to be accredited. Maybe you know what accreditation means. You need to certify the certifier to be sure, the guy is able to do the job. But you need to use this third-party certification body if you want, to be compliant with ISO approach, if you want to call that. And of course, if you want to keep, your certification, you need to, if you want to maintain, your certification over time, you need to maintain, of course, your conformity with the standard to be recertified, because most of the time, the certification is time limited, and normally it's around three years, if I remember well.
Excellent. So now we open up a lot of, we have an initial table setting, but that opens up a lot of potential discussion, and that's kind of what we want to get into next. First, I want to double click on that, the whole management system. Right. I imagine most of the audience are not familiar with the whole concept of a management system standard, and how does that all relate to things like certifying for GDPR, which stipulates the certification of data processing activities. So can any of you please jump in, talk about why we would need a management system on top of all these auditing of data processing activities in the standard.
You guys don't mind? Okay. Management systems. Let's go back to fundamentals. In the ISO world, there are a couple of different kinds of standards. There are standards that define the requirements for products. For example, the USB connector we all know quite well is standardized by an ISO standard. But there are also standards that are guidance documents that tell organizations what they should consider, might consider. It's a collection of best practice. And then there are standards that are requirement standards. Standards that say the organization must do something in order to fulfill the requirements of the standard. And these are the kind of standards that allow organizations to be certified to. One subset of this standard are the management system standards. And I'm pretty sure that everybody in this room has heard about quality management system and ISO 9001. This is the oldest management system standard that is out there, and is pretty much the foundation for every other management system standard in existence. From, as I said, 9,000 for quality, 14,000 for environmental, and 27001 for information security. And all those management system standards are built on the same principle. The organization shall identify the context in which they operate. So that means first the organization needs to ask themselves, what are we actually doing and where? And who are the interested parties we are dealing with? And what are the requirements of those interested parties? After that, the organization needs to do a risk assessment, identifying what are the risks they are exposed to, or in this case, what are the risks with regard to PII. Then, after they have identified the risks, they need to identify suitable controls. And suitable controls in terms of minimizing the risk. After that, they need to verify whether the identified compensating controls are indeed matching with the controls identified in the standard. And most likely they will, but there will be also additional controls the organization now needs to implement. And then comes the fun part. There's always something like an internal audit. There's always something like corrective action process. There's always something like management review. So the management system standards are providing the framework for the governance of a system. And fundamentally, the internal audit system is the most powerful tool the organization has at their disposal to identify gaps. From a third-party auditor's perspective, if an organization tells me our internal auditors didn't find anything, this is just an invitation to start digging, because I guarantee you there are issues. On the other hand, if an organization says, yeah, sorry to say, there were a couple of issues here and there, and this is how we address that, then I know that the system actually works. It's based on the idea of plan, do, check, act, right? You plan something, you do it, you check it, recognize that there are some kind of challenges, problems, whatever we may call them, improve, repeat, and sooner or later it will be better. So management systems are really emphasizing that the organization has the responsibility to review the environment and constantly, continuously improves their system. A little comment to a comment earlier. ISO 27001 is the standard for information security. It's not about IT security, it's about information security. Right. We are all exchanging information, right? Where are computers involved right now? There are no computers involved right now. Maybe somebody is typing some notes on an iPad or so, but generically speaking, we are exchanging information right now verbally, right? And the question is, how do we protect information in general terms? Now, in a corporate environment, IT is obviously the foundation for a lot of activities, so therefore 27001 has the tendency to be very IT focused, but it shouldn't. It should be really broader and wider. I hope this explains a little bit management systems.
Yeah, and of course, within the standard itself, management system captures one portion of it, right? 27701 also involved enhancement to existing 27002 techniques, right, and guidance, and also has controllers and processors guidance. So would any one of you want to elaborate on what are those controllers and processors guidance out there?
Yeah, sorry, I go back.
Willy, you want to grab the mic again?
Or Erik?
Anybody else?
Oh, yes.
Erik, you go ahead.
And then you can add something. Yes, so that's a thing to remember. It's that 27701 is a two-part standard, I would say. There's, of course, the management system part, which is, I would say, quite simple. Because, well, you take 27001 and you add privacy at each point where you have information security. So it's information security and privacy everywhere. So it's quite simple. The other part is the extension of 27002, which are guidance controls that are really practical things that you have to do in order to comply with the standard. and to protect information security and privacy. So then again, this extension is, I would say, two-phased, because first you have some enhancement of very common controls, such as what is role-based authentication in terms of privacy management. You see, it's what are backups, and how do you do backups if you want to protect privacy? So it's an extension of common controls, and also you have the very specific privacy principles, such as consent, such as right of access, all the things that are really specific in terms of rights of people, and also obligations for the data processors and data controllers.
Can I just add one thing? When I was reviewing the ISO standard, it was helpful to me, and I undertook a project because I thought it might be helpful to the broader community to take a look at how the ISO standard maps to the bodies of knowledge that are connected to IAPP's certifications. And there is kind of publicly available, we did this whole mapping, but I mention it now because, you know, there's four main substantive sections of the standard. And the first two map really directly to our certified information privacy manager. If you're familiar with that, it's the process, right? The system you put in place to manage your privacy. The second two sections, as Erik just mentioned, are focused kind of principles-based, and they map almost directly to our CIPPE, which is, of course, built on the GDPR, so much more principles-based. So if you think of it in those four parts, I consider at least the first two very kind of process management, process-focused, and then the second two, you know, tied to the laws around the world, but also hewing very closely to GDPR.
Okay. Anything to add on the panel? If none, I'll move forward. We'll actually, I want to double click on a couple more things, and then we'll move on to the really fun part of the debate today. First has to do with the tied in between security and privacy. We talked quite a bit about that. And can the panel kind of talk about why it makes sense to stitch the two together? Because from time to time, when I talk to experts out there, I do hear the question of how can we just don't have one just for privacy and just leave the security alone and leave it to ISO 27001 or SOC 1, SOC 2, those established one, and just have an island of privacy? Why do we need to stitch them together here?
One argument could be to avoid audit fatigue. Let's face it, there are so many assessments already taking place. I know Microsoft has a full-fledged team of hundreds of people that are just professional auditees, according to their business card statement. So the question is obviously, how can we scale the assessment of an organization? And part of that is obviously building upon something that already exists. ISO 27001 certification exists. There is a system that already governs and regulates and stipulates what are the requirements for good information security hygiene, whether this is onboarding of people, whether this is access management, whether this is data destruction, and so on and so forth, right? Now, when you look at all that basic fundamental stuff that comes from information security, it makes a lot of sense to use that as the foundation to build then the first or the second floor, depending on how you count it, you know, ground floor versus first floor in the US and in Europe, right? To build upon that with the requirements of the personally identifiable information protection. At the end of the day, if you want to protect PII, one question is obviously who has access to that information, and how do you manage the onboarding and offboarding of people who have access to PII? Why would you create another system if there is already a system in place, e.g. but not limited to 27001? Of course you should leverage that. So therefore it makes a lot of sense to use ISO 27001 as the foundation and then go for 27701 additional requirements.
Yes, please.
So,
No, go ahead.
just a little take. It was also a very practical thing. I would say that there are already thousands of companies who are certified with the 27001, so it makes sense to just add some privacy level on top of that. And also, if you look at guidelines for CNIL and other DPAs, you will see that before we ask you to consider privacy issues, we just will have you to look at basic information security techniques, because yes, it's really hard to handle privacy if you don't have the data protection, basic data protection controls in place.
Yeah, well, I fully agree with you. And maybe if we are coming back to the basics, security is a requirement, is a basic requirement in GDPR if you are looking into the law. But the reason why it makes sense, to have, these standards based on security. It's good for business as well, I think, for yours and for ISO as well. I think it's also, good for business in a general way, because security today, IT or information security is a big requirement, I would say, if you want to operate safely, in the cyber world. That's why it makes sense, to have this, in a standard. I'm not fully convinced, having, two standards, one on information security and the other, on privacy, is really a good idea, especially, when you are looking at small companies, because certification and I would say all the stuff you need to do internally, to align your process and your processing with the standard is costly. It takes time. You need resources. That's why I'm not sure we are fully compliant with the requirement coming in Article 42.1, if I remember well, from the GDPR, requiring, the authority to take care about the SMEs, special needs. But well, I would say it's better than nothing.
Yeah. Well, this actually, Willy, do you want to jump in?
Yes, quick comment. In November, we launched the first round of certification to 27701 globally. And yes, there were humongous organizations with, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of employees. But there was also a very small organization, just 12 people.
Lucky they are. You make special prize.
Yes. So what I wanted to use that, I wanted to use that as an example for, yes, SMEs are being considered in the standard. That's one of the beauty of management system standards. It's really a wonderful approach to cover small organizations as well as multinational, multi-billion-dollar companies. Because it always starts with the organization shall identify the context. Right? And if there is a SME with 12 employees, the context is different than for Microsoft.
Yeah, I agree. I fully agree with you, and especially if I remember well, there is a dedicated ISO standard in which you are calculating, the time you are going to spend on the audit to be sure, it's well adapted, to the target you are going to certify, assess, whatever. I agree. But if you are looking, I'm a practitioner at the same time, and if you are looking only in my country, I'm able to discuss about, France and Switzerland in which I'm working. Well, it's costly. Whatever, you are doing, and especially it's costly for one, and people, are thinking how to comply with ISO 27001, which is for them, the most important, to operate, on business. And then when you are saying, okay, I'm coming with an extension and you will have to do both the job, well, I say, okay, guys, you're nice, but you want me, to pay you until your retirement. They say, no, but it's quite important for you, and they agree about that. But again, that's, I think, a very huge and structuring, decision, to apply something like this. It's certainly very useful, I agree with you, when you are organizing all the business processing, but it's, a huge job, to comply with it.
Cristina?
A very provocative question.
Willy, I'm going to take a pause. Cristina has been waiting to jump in patiently,
I'm
so
sorry,
I
I'm
am going
too
to
talkative.
Sorry, and
exercise
thank
the
you very
right
much.
of the moderator.
Yes, but well, you mentioned the precise articles in the GDPR which provide for certification. I wanted to jump in and first of all to thank you all for explaining what the core components and the rationale behind this technical standard is. And for many of us, this topic of standardization is quite complex. So understanding what is available on the market, how this technical standard work is really crucial. And of course, in particular, we should leverage all the work and also the ecosystem that is behind an ISO standard. And in this particular regard, for this ISO standard, from my perspective, there are surely many advantages. And in particular, this idea of having a tool which is in a way legislation agnostic or neutral is particularly important. Just at the beginning of this discussion, we saw how many different laws are around the world, and despite we see a lot of convergence on the main elements of in these laws, there are of course specific nuances that need to be taken into account. So from my perspective, a tool like this technical standard has a very special value because in a way it allows to translate the requirements of different legislation in a common technical language that then companies can operationalize. So the Commission, of course, encourages these kind of initiatives, and we have to also remember that standards and certification mechanisms are voluntary processes to help demonstrate compliance, and of course they are very valuable in the sense that they increase the transparency both vis-a-vis the data subject, but also in the relation between companies, so business-to-business relations. And we see that certification in general is based on this idea of showing accountability, also embedding this idea of privacy by design since the beginning. So in a way, they reflect widespread principles. But of course, when we think about data protection certification under the GDPR, we have to take into consideration that we have a very specific model, and the provisions in the GDPR are Article 42 and 43. And one question we might ask is why we have these specificities. Why can't we just use exactly the same procedures and approach and models that we have for any other product? Why is privacy and data protection special in this regard? Well, of course, data protection is a fundamental right, and that is why it is an aspect that needs also the involvement of regulators in a way. So that's why in our GDPR model, data protection authorities are so central, because it is felt that this is not an area where you can leave it entirely to the private sector. So you need a prominent role of the regulators as well. And this is precisely a special characteristic. And what also distinguishes data protection from other areas is that you have to take into account the data subject's rights and you also have to have appropriate enforcement mechanisms. So in this regard, when we look at this particular standard, of course, as mentioned, there are many, many useful aspects. What we need to now think is what alignment is required to make it work also in a GDPR context. The European data protection authorities have already provided some guidance on certification and accreditation under the GDPR. They have explained the scope and the object of certification. Indeed, there is this idea of having to explain the processing operation that you want to certify, always with an eye on the final user, the data subject. So also you see that we come from different perspectives here. Technical standards built by the industry, they focus on they have the company perspective, and in this certification under the GDPR we have to consider also the final data subject and its rights. So as certification is currently being developed in Europe, I think that this discussion today is very, very timely. This work that has been done is extremely useful, and certainly we shouldn't reinvent the wheel. So we need to build on what is already there. An ISO standard, of course, it goes without saying, it's a global standard, so that's also very important. We also see in other parts of the world other initiatives which are very interesting, and for instance, just to mention one, we see other certification products like the privacy mark in Japan as very promising. So we see a lot of interesting initiatives in this regard, and then maybe, I don't know if we want to discuss this now or maybe later, the issue of certification as a tool to enable international data flows. So maybe this is for later? Or
yeah, I think we would definitely have to tap into that later.
Okay.
Certainly, I think the first thing I would think of, and this is a perfect segue to our next stage of our discussion, is certainly about clarifying the connection between ISO 27701 and GDPR, right? They're not the same. They're not supposed to be the same. But I see in the standard itself that's an annex that is really important. And it actually maps line by line between the standard and GDPR, at least the GDPR parts that are relevant to controls and processors' behaviors. So can anybody elaborate on that relationship? And really, I will throw up the questions, right? Does it actually cover GDPR, right? Does a standard like ISO 27701 cover GDPR? So I see a lot of smiles and head nodding, so jump in and grab the mic.
You want me to start? Yeah.
Sure,
well,
go for it.
Thank you, Eunice. Well, just to build on what you said just before, there is also something we should bear in mind. As you know, the model suggested by the ISO is built, on a risk-based approach, which is, not really, what we have, in the GDPR. They are not using, a risk-based approach for everything. That's why I would say this is, again, something we need to map. This is not only, the content, this is also, the approach. And I will say also, to bridge the requirements, to bridge also, the terminology, because sometimes it's not fully aligned. And I agree with you, there is certainly some bridge to build, but we need to keep in mind from different stages about the approach, about the content, about the terminology, and of course, beneath of that, all that stuff of certification, if you want to align, with Article 42 regime.
No. Any other thoughts, Erik?
Yes. Well, I would say, in fact, that this new standard is, yes, compatible with GDPR, mostly compatible, and I would say covers most of the requirements for GDPR. The terminology won't be the same. You might have some questions about, well, bridging the two, but, well, let's see a little comparison. First, basic principle of GDPR is accountability. And, well, if you have a management system and you have certification process, well, you have to document what you do what you document, etc., plan, do, check, act, and that's part of governance and accountability. That's the main compatibility from the global GDPR perspective. Also, GDPR is about protecting data. And, well, there's also a risk-based approach where, because in the GDPR you have a privacy impact assessment, which is kind of risk approach regarding privacy issues. And then, again, in 27001, 002, 005, you have the common risk-based approach and security controls. So that also maps quite well together. And then you'll find in 27701, I would say the data subjects' rights and obligations companies and organizations have towards data subjects, which are, I would say, information, notice, consent, right of access, right of data deletion, etc., which are, I would say, more human rights oriented. And that's also the very new thing, I would say, in this standard, because as you see, 27701 is both management, is both risk-based, information security, and also human rights approach. So it's all-encompassing, and that's also what GDPR is. So I think basically it really maps well together, and I would say we worked in order to achieve that.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Willy?
Yes. It is compatible. It's not. Or as we say in German, jein. Yes and no at the same time. So yes, there is the annex that is mapping the standard line for line to GDPR, which is fantastic, which emphasizes that the standard is indeed able to support organizations to fulfill GDPR requirements. However, in Article 4243, GDPR is talking about that the certification body, so for example, a company like BSI, needs to be accredited to ISO 17 or 65. That is a small little itsy-bitsy tiny issue, because management system standards like ISO 27001, 27701 require that the certification body, BSI, is accredited to 17 or 21. True. So what's the difference between 21 and 65? Fundamentally nothing. But yes, there are differences which are spelled out in the applicable ISO standards in terms of how the assessments need to be done, how the depth of the audits need to be done. So that has implications in terms of, the actual assessment. So certification to ISO 27701, by definition being a management system standard, in the future hopefully being accreditatable, for lack of a better word, to 17 or 21, will not fulfill GDPR certification, because that would require 17 or 65. Yeah. So that's the current status. How that is going to develop in the future, we will see. Mm-hmm. But at this very moment in time, unfortunately, 27701 certification does not fulfill GDPR certification requirements.
Anything to add, Erik? And both Erik.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Just to add a little summary about this question of accreditation, just to say that GDPR is more goods and services oriented, and 27701 is more oriented on the management system. But, there are ways to bridge both, because if you have a management system in place, then you handle your own products and services. But, we'll have to see the details about that.
We already did it, with the DPO. It's interesting. It's interesting. I'm not really.
Can you get closer to the mic?
I fully agree with you, and I think there is an issue about that. I would like to add, this is not, into the scope of Article 42.1, and if you are looking also, to the law, normally when you are building a scheme, a certification scheme, under the GDPR regime, you should refer, to the GDPR. That's why it will be certainly difficult. But does it matter at the end? Well, I don't think it's really, because certification is also something, you can use to credibilize, what you are doing with your clients, when you are a processor, when you are exporting or importing data, and it could be done outside Article 42 regime. And why not doing like this and saying, okay, this is something which is helping, to comply with the data protection principle, and at the end, this is welcome, even if does not align, and I don't know if it is really useful to try to align with the GDPR. It could be something, you are supplementing with a GDPR, I would say focusing certification, or doing additional requirement to comply with it. Why trying, to align? I'm not sure this is a good way to work.
That's interesting. Anything? Want to add to it? No? Oh, Erik, you have a rebuttal. All right.
Just a little thing. Yes, it's really also about how you want to use certification. Because, well, if you comply with 27701 internally, then, well, you are sure that you are handling privacy issues and data subjects' rights, well, in the right way. And then, what do you want to do with that? Is that just for your own satisfaction, or do you want to prove that to authorities, regulators, customers, other companies, etc.? So that's the tricky part, and that, well, you have to have some choice, but in the end, 27701 is a basic guidelines of how to handle privacy, and is, I would say, a global ISO standard, which is quite a thing.
Yeah. So one thing I would like to kind of zoom in on a little bit before we move on to regulations outside of Europe is that we talked about how that aligns between GDPR and 27701, but they are not like word for word the same, right? I'll just take one example, like data breach notification, right? We have the 72 hours notification requirement in GDPR, right? But the standard itself, it says you may have a clock you have to watch. It doesn't say 72 hours. So, of course, it's a feature and not a bug, because the next country, just, name one that doesn't have a regulation already in place or updating theirs, they might say 48 hours, right? And then another country, after I just came back from China, where in Hong Kong in particular, they don't have any data breach notification requirements at all. So you have a data breach, you don't have to tell them.
Yeah.
Right? So how will that work so I already start the table set for the next stage, but tell me about how you inspect whether a company adheres to the 72 hours, particularly in GDPR, and how does that kind of gel together when you have multiple jurisdictions in play? Go, everybody.
Everybody, okay.
Yeah.
The organization shall identify the context.
Yeah.
So that's the fundamental statement, right? If an organization is operating in Hong Kong, they should know what the regulations there are. And if the regulation is not specific, like in Hong Kong, that's okay. If they are operating in a jurisdiction where there is very strict requirements, like 72 hours or 48 hours, they should know. And if they know, they need to implement appropriate processes. That's the beauty of an ISO standard. The organization shall identify their context. And based upon that, they need to fine-tune their system.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of speak to that at a broader or higher level, which is that I feel the need to admit that I was always in my past roles and such kind of allergic to the notion of standards. And I think that's because the way, at least I conceptualized them, was sameness, that we all had to kind of come together and agree that this is the way it will be done. And so if you're looking at this, which maps really closely to GDPR, are we all agreeing, really, we're just going to say GDPR is the standard? But no, that's, as everyone has said very eloquently here, it's a translation. You're looking at the context, and I think that is so valuable. And so when you pose the question, does this align with GDPR? How does this align even with rules around the world? It's an interesting question almost because it doesn't have to match directly, and I think that's what folks are saying and what Cristina is saying when it's she references a translation. Alex, you've spoken about scoping what your certification is, and so if you're operating in the U.S. and you have operations in X number of states, and you're also operating in France, and you're also operating in Japan, then the standard demands that you look at the context, and it specifies that you are in compliance with those jurisdictions. So when Willy or whomever else is certifying you, they're certifying based on the scope that yes, you meet the standards of the regulatory regime in Michigan, and this is simply providing you the controls or considerations where you need, your certifier will look at whether you're in compliance with those local rules. And I think data breach is a great example there, but I think that is really helpful as a way for all of us to come together and for organizations to look at this as they try to deal with hundreds of laws around the world.
I partly agree with you. When you are saying, okay, this is a guideline and this is a way, to work, and it gives you, high-level guidelines. But if you are, in a particular country and you have to deal with 20, in which you have many conflicting, requirements, but the standard does not say how to manage this conflict. And at the end, you are in the same position. If you have to comply, with this different regulation. And the standard, unfortunately, does not say, okay, when you have a conflict, between two requirements, which one you are going to take. It will be very helpful. I agree with you. You have a guideline. It tells you what do you do. All right, okay, you can take this topic, but it does not say in this particular topic how you are going to behave when you are in Hong Kong, when you are in Europe, in US. What will be the conflict deal with? It's quite, I think, important if you have to rework a little bit on this standard.
Cristina, then
just
Erik, then back to Willy, we'll just go down. Yeah.
I understand that this standard is a sort of baseline, so it offers like a framework. Yeah. And then you have to fill it in with the different requirements you have depending on where you operate, which kind of processing activities you carry out, and where. So in that regard, yes, the value of such a standard, from my perspective, is precisely this framework that then needs to be contextualized. And maybe one additional thing I wanted to include in the debate, and again, talking from the perspective of what the GDPR offers. So I mentioned before that certification in general is recognized and welcome as a tool to show compliance, to demonstrate compliance in the way you process data. But it is also included in the toolbox allowing international transfer. So from our perspective, the idea is that the whole idea behind the GDPR is that we want to ensure a high level of protection of the data, and we also want to allow data to flow freely, provided that this protection go with the data. So the GDPR has enhanced or enlarged the toolbox of possibilities that you might use to transfer data across jurisdictions. And certification is one of them. It's a new, it's a novelty, I would say, of the GDPR. And precisely now, the European data protection authorities are working on what the specific requirements would be. Because in addition to the compliance aspect, you also have to ensure that through certification, you are offering the appropriate safeguards. And this is a key concept, I think. Appropriate safeguard is what we have in the current, in all the tools allowing the free flow of data. So be standard contractual clauses, binding corporate rules, or of course, if you have a country which is deemed adequate, you don't need any of these. You are free to move the data there without any restrictions. But now this concept of certification is there, and the work is focusing on how to ensure that the appropriate safeguards are included, considering the specificities of the governance model that you need for certification under the GDPR.
Erik, Boucher, back to Willy, and then back to Erik.
Yes, just very shortly, back to the conflicting aspects between jurisdiction, but I think, Alex, you have spent more time than I about that. But just wanted to say that, well, if in some jurisdiction you have to notify about the clients about a data breach, and in other you don't have to, well, anyway, it's a good thing to do that. It's always better to notify your clients yourself than have a journalist write about it.
This is the approach, and you are saying that you are going to take the most requiring, requirements into the jurisdiction. Why not? It could be an approach, but it could be a trade-off as well. And my only, maybe you have something else to say. Yeah, there is something I wanted to, and that's nice. You were talking about that just before. It's about the private standard. We are talking about a private standard, which is done by private people, which is not accessible for free. In which, you were involved because the law in France offers you to do it, but this is not always the case in the other countries. And we should also keep in mind of this aspect. We are talking about, law, we are talking about fundamental principle, and then we are relying on a private standard, which is done most of the time by a big company. That's why there are, in my opinion, two aspects here we should bear in mind, which is the access to the standard. You have to pay it. It's around, 200 francs right now. I think it's quite difficult for a young researcher to have access. And as well, how do we handle the problem of the drafting, and to be sure, civil society representative are involved into, this process, which is quite important as well.
Mm-hmm.
The theme, the subject concerning fulfilling, possibly contradicting legal requirements, I think can be relatively easy addressed by using the standard in terms of the risk assessment. So if an organization is operating in Japan, they need to fulfill the Japanese laws, right? If an organization is operating in Europe, they obviously need to fulfill European law. And in their risk assessment, they will identify there is the risk of fulfilling either one, but not both at the same time. Then they need to come up with compensating controls. And one of the compensating controls could be to have different websites in Japan versus Europe, having different data sets in either region. And if indeed there is a data transfer necessary for whatever operational reasons, then they need to have the appropriate controls and mechanisms in place. So I think ISO 27001 as well as ISO 27701 have this powerful tool of risk assessment and then compensating controls. So I'm not overly worried about that conflict of fulfilling possibly contradicting legal requirements.
I think this is what we're seeing in kind of the survey data that we started with, that companies want to adopt a global strategy, but that they recognize that in certain instances, maybe certain places, they'll need to have regional nuances that they adopt as necessary.
Yeah. So yeah, on the other hand, there's also the difference between the regulatory requirement not being the same as versus if you fulfill one, you cannot fulfill the other.
Yeah.
I'll say those are extreme rarity, right? And 99% of the regulations, if you match it line by line, you would not find conflict, right? In fact, it would be less than 1% of the case that you have if you meet one, you cannot meet the other. Would that
Did
be
you do
a
a
good
risk
generalization?
assessment on flipping the glass?
Yes, unfortunately not.
I think we saved the technology.
It's a Microsoft one. Yeah. I'm confident.
All right, so I'm watching the clock, and I realize we're running pretty short in time, but it is really important for us to really talk about the cross-border data flow aspect of it. Cristina, you spoke quite a bit about the safeguard from the consumer, and it's and we talked about that in the last few days in person, that for certification, just having a certification that meets Article 42 requirements is not sufficient for cross-border data flow. That has to be additional safeguard for, I would just summarize as consumer redress. Would that be correct? Jeez. All right. You guys won't have that much time to ask questions because I'm going to ask all the questions. So what I would do is maybe ask everybody really quickly, maybe particularly Cristina, what will be the mechanism to address that? If you have just an Article 42 certification, what would an organization need to do to cross that bridge, right, to get to have the redress in place?
Maybe I can just start, and as I was explaining before, I mean, we have other tools available, like standard contractual clauses or binding corporate rules, where you have this appropriate safeguard well defined. This is the standard, so this is what we need to achieve, and it includes, like, for instance, just to give a practical example, in the standard contractual clauses you have the so-called third beneficiary clause that enables the data subject to do certain things, to exercise his rights. And then, again, linking back to what I said at the very beginning, you have this aspect of data subjects' rights, but also effective remedies. So these rights need to be enforceable, and that's why you need a mechanism, and this is why the DPA have to come into the picture, and they have a role in the definition of the criteria, in the accreditation, and so on. And that's, I think, those are the aspects that we need to continue to work on in order to achieve an effective and coherent system for certification under the GDPR. So just to conclude from my perspective, again, I think that this ISO standard is very promising, and I see a big value in the fact that there is this whole ecosystem behind. It's quite solid, and it has been in place since many years. And so it's a very important baseline on top of which we can continue to build something useful.
Okay. So with that, I actually want to give the audience 1 or 2 minutes to ask questions. So jump in, grab a mic, queue it up. We'll handle it as many as we can until they kick us out. How's that?
Hi.
Please identify yourself.
Yeah, sorry for being anonymous. I'm Tor from Denmark. I'm part of the Danish Association for Data Protection Officers, multiple different things. A question regarding the approval process for the ISO standard. So you were talking on the point because I was trying to figure out the latest information. In October last year, some presentations were given by EDPS staff, as far as I can see, where the conclusion so far is the European Data Protection Seal will not be a possibility for the ISO standards. but they're moving forward with the ISDP 10003 and also European Privacy Seal. So any of you have any information on that specific stamp of approval process?
No, just to say that it's a real question that is not settled yet at all.
Okay. So it's still being debated?
Yes, there are many discussions, for example, at European Data Protection Board level about how to use the different certification and standards and to meet with the GDPR certification.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's, I believe that will be what we call misinformation, if we use the kind word. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the panel. I have one quick question. I'm looking particularly at Erik. So what will be the role of ISO in the broader context of Article 42 and 43 GDPR? Especially because if you're looking at GDPR, especially in Article 43.6, there is this requirement that the criteria on the basis of which accredited certification bodies will actually need to make every information available. So how do you reconcile that necessity to make that information publicly available with the fact that ISO standards are actually provided for money? So that's kind of, how do you reconcile that? So I totally reckon the amazing work of ISO because I've been quickly involved as well. But there is still for me this like very strange disconnect between availability and the fact that you need to pay.
I'll jump in this one real quick. As far as I know, and this is not necessarily the case everywhere, I know for sure in Germany, ISO standards are available through library for free. So this is like reference material that you'll find, like encyclopedia or any type of reference material that you'll be able to get from the library researcher. In some cases, they are more comprehensive. In Germany, in some places, that is free through the public library. So you may have it in the university library to get it for free, and that, I think that belief that's an option. So anybody got any thoughts on that?
I do not fully agree with you. This is the case in France, but this is the case also, in different European countries, in which you are recognizing, the standard as part of your legislation. And then when, it has been recognized, it will be available for free and included into your legislation. And this is the way it works. And then I'm not sure it will be the case, for this one. If not, I don't know what the European Commission is going to do, but because they have the right, to promote and write standards or issue standards, and maybe they are going to endorse. It would be certainly a good idea, but so far that's not the case. It depends, I would say, of the country you are working with.
Yeah, also there are a number of harmonized European standards which are part of all the regulatory process, and actually almost all of them are fee-based.
But you are talking about harmonized standards who have been done, by European standardization bodies, which are quite different.
European harmonized standards, those are effectively the way you adhere to the law, is to adhere to the standards. Now, of course, most of those, are we talking about like food safety, that sort of things, generally is not for consumer to go assess, right? So that's probably less of a demand, and that's less of a, people raising their hands and having some concern. In this case, there's data subjects out there, of course, that's different. No. Paul?
Paul Breitbart, Trust Stark. I've got many questions. I'll limit to one. The devil is in the detail, so much is clear, especially if you want to comply with that multitude of laws, whether it is via an ISO standard or any of the other standards that are under development. Don't you agree there is a risk that companies that are certified assume that they are automatically compliant with all the laws, especially since these standards are being pushed so hard, and then forget about the delta, all the outliers, all the nitty-gritty details? And I disagree with you, it's 99% alignment. It's rather 80 or 90% than 99. There is quite a number of very specific details for compliance. If we only look at GDPR and CCPA, for example, what needs to be addressed?
Long question, short answer, yes.
Let me just jump in. That is kind of what I was trying to address, that even just over the past few days, as we've kind of talked in workshops around this, it's been eye-opening to me to think about this as With regard to each of the controls that are outlined here, it says you need to have a process for handling complaints, right? But it doesn't say you need to have a 45-day response time or a 30-day response time. But it says in the standard, based on the scope of your certification and the countries in which you're operating, you need to comply with the local law and what it says with regard to that. So I think it does address it. It just doesn't say, I know that you're in Michigan and Hong Kong and Germany, because not everyone's going to be in the same. But it does specify you need to be in compliance with, for instance, the response times in the places you're operating when they're within the scope of this certification. So,
and will BSI and other certification providers...
Can you get the mic? Can you get the mic?
And will BSI and other certification providers also look at all that detail and take that into account in the certification and in the follow-up?
That's part of the scope, and therefore, yes. And that's the reason why it's extremely challenging to determine the audit duration. So 27006, the standard that governs the duration of audits for 27001, is based on a concept of number of employees in the organization. And we came to the conclusion that this is not necessarily the best approach for determining the audit duration for 27701. So for 27701, we proposed the idea of the number of data subject records to be the determining factor. And then obviously complexity and geographic diversity. So yes, if indeed Michigan and Japan and Germany or whatever is the area of operation for the company, that is then part of the scope, and then the auditors would need to verify, so how do you know what are the requirements in Japan? Aha, there I have 20 days notification time, wonderful, show me how you make sure. Yeah. But I also would like to emphasize auditing by its very, very nature is based on sampling. So it's quite possible that the organization is operating in Michigan and Illinois and in Japan and in Germany, and for whatever, the auditors are not checking the requirements for Illinois, which would break my heart being from Chicago.
All right, I think we totally ran out of time, but I'll just do one conclusive remark. Look, every country's got food safety regulations. They're all different. But somehow, some way, that box of Oreo still goes everywhere, right? So we can do this. This problem has been solved. It's been solved in a much more, people can die, right, if food is not safe. We've dealt with much tougher problem before. It's privacy, it is new, but we can learn from other industry, other experience, and this is one way to address that. And I want to thank all the panels and your time and the audience.
Thank you.